Section 12 of Louis Pasteur by Albert Keim and Louis Lumet, translated by Frederick Tabor Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8. Hydrophobia. Mad dogs were formerly the terror of the countryside. The mysterious character of the malady, its frightful consequences to those whom it attacked, classed it among those scourges of the fields against which no certain remedy was known. In ancient times Pliny the Elder advised those who had been bitten to eat the liver of the dog who had done the harm, while Gallian prescribed as a remedy the eyes of crabs. During the Middle Ages, which were haunted by mad dogs, the remedies used were omelettes made of ground oyster shells and cauterization of the wound with red-hot irons. But most frequently they stifled the unhappy sufferers between two mattresses. In the 18th century, a lieutenant of police named Lenoir founded a prize of £1,200 to be awarded by the Royal Society of Medicine to the author of the best paper on the methods of curing hydrophobia. It was won by a certain Dr. Roux, a physician at Dijon, and among the methods of saving those who had been bitten, he recommended cauterization with hot irons, and more especially with antimony trichloride, butter of antimony. In the 18th century, the problem of hydrophobia, although it had been studied more scientifically, had made but little progress until Pasteur caused a sensation by discovering its solution. He began his researches in 1880 with the collaboration of Doctors Chamberlain, Roux, and Thuillier. We cannot follow them through all the details of the long succession of exceedingly delicate experiments that often had to be commenced all over again in order to obtain assured results, but a very simple summary will make it clear that Pasteur's genius was as fruitful as ever, and that his illness had in no wise impaired his qualities as an experimenter. On the 10th of December, 1880, Pasteur, being informed by Dr. Lanlong that he had under treatment at Trousseau a 5-year-old child who had been bitten by a mad dog, went to obtain a specimen of his saliva. In the saliva he discovered a microbe which was not that of hydrophobia, and which, when injected into rabbits, caused their death within 2 days of a different disease. Nevertheless, the saliva contained the microbes of hydrophobia, but they lost all their virulence within 24 hours. Since rabies chiefly affects the nerve centres, Pasteur inoculated rabbits and dogs with the cranial marrow of rabid dogs. The subjects inoculated developed hydrophobia after a greater or less lapse of time, and the experiments became difficult to follow and to control. In order to hasten the period of inoculation, Pasteur conceived the idea of injecting the matter containing the germs directly into the dogs' skulls, but the idea of trepanning necessitated by the injection was repugnant to him. He could witness without much distress a simple operation such as subcutaneous inoculation, writes M. Roux, although even then, if the animal cried a little, Pasteur would be overcome with pity and make his escape, lavishing on the victim words of consolation and encouragement, which would have seemed comical if they had not been so touching. The thought that a dog's skull would have to be perforated was most unpleasant to him. He was keenly anxious to have the experiment tried, yet he shrank from seeing it undertaken. I did it one day when he was absent. The following day, when I reported to him that the intracranial inoculation offered no difficulties, he fell to pitying the dog. Poor beast! Its brain is no doubt ruptured. It must be paralyzed. Without reply, I descended to the basement to get the animal, and brought it back with me to the laboratory. Pasteur was not fond of dogs, but when he saw this one full of spirits and curiously exploring the premises, he exhibited the keenest satisfaction, and began to lavish terms of endearment upon it. he felt an infinite gratitude toward this particular dog for having stood the trepanning so well, and thus having put an end to all his scruples in regard to future trepanning. The experiment succeeded, and the period of inoculation was reduced to 20 days, and it was demonstrated that the principal seat of the malady was in the nervous centres. To the first results, which were of a theoretic character, Pasteur became ambitious to add others of a practical nature. Was it possible to render dogs immune to hydrophobia after they had been bitten, as he had rendered cattle and sheep immune to anthrax, and could this immunity be extended to man? The problem was quite complex, for he did not know the microbe of hydrophobia, which had barely been detected by Dr. Roux, in the form of points almost imperceptible under the most powerful microscopes. It was here that the inventive genius of Pasteur displayed itself. Since he could not cultivate these microbes in appropriate liquids and attenuate them according to the method that he had used in the case of anthrax and chicken cholera, he conceived the idea of cultivating them from rabbit to rabbit, and in this way he obtained a fixed maximum of virulence, which reduced the period of inoculation to 7 days. But how was the virus to be transformed into vaccine? Pasteur observed that the infected marrows, when brought into contact with dry air, lost their virulence in proportion to the length of time they were exposed, becoming almost harmless after 15 days. The attenuated virus having been found by a process which, although hardly scientific, was certain, the next facts to ascertain were, first, whether inoculation with this vaccine virus would render dogs resistant to hydrophobia, and secondly, whether inoculation would prevent the disease from appearing and developing in animals that had been bitten. The experiments were long and full of difficulties. The laboratory in the Rue d'Ulm no longer sufficed to contain all the subjects. The State placed at Pasteur's disposal more extensive quarters at Villeneuve-l'Étang, near Saint-Cloud. Finally, his experiments achieved this double result. Hydrophobia could be communicated to animals by inoculation, and on the other hand, inoculation with attenuated virus rendered dogs resistant to hydrophobia and prevented the disease from appearing in those who had been bitten. Pasteur was sure of the efficacy of his discovery, but he hesitated to apply his method to human beings. "I have not yet dared to make any attempt upon man," he wrote to the Emperor of Brazil, "in spite of my confidence as to the result, and in spite of the numerous opportunities that have been offered me since my last lecture at the Academy of Sciences. I am too much afraid of a failure which would compromise my future plans. I want first to collect a multitude of successful cases of the treatment of animals. In this respect matters are going well. I already have numerous examples of dogs rendered immune after having been bitten. I take 2 dogs and I cause them to be bitten by another dog that is mad. I vaccinate one of them and I leave the other without treatment. The latter dies of hydrophobia, the one that was vaccinated is immune. But no matter to what extent I should multiply these examples of the prophylaxis of hydrophobia in dogs, it seems to me that my hand would inevitably tremble when the time came to apply the treatment to a human being. Here is where the high and powerful initiative of the sovereign of a state might intervene most profitably for the greatest good of humanity. If I were king or emperor or even president of the Republic, this is the way in which I should exercise my right to pardon prisoners condemned to death. I should offer the condemned man, through his lawyer, on the eve of his client's execution, the choice between imminent death and an experiment consisting of preventive inoculation of hydrophobia for the purpose of rendering his constitution immune to that disease. Aside from the risks of these experiments, the life of the condemned man would be spared. In case the experiments should succeed, in point of fact I am sure they would, in order to protect society, which had previously condemned the criminal, he should be kept in custody for the rest of his life. Every condemned man would accept, for the only thing which a condemned man fears is death. This brings me to the question of cholera, which Your Majesty also had the goodness to discuss with me. Neither Doctors Strauss and Roux nor Dr. Koch have succeeded in infecting animals with cholera. Hence there is a great uncertainty regarding the bacillus which Dr. Koch believes to be the cause of cholera. We ought to be allowed to try to give cholera to criminals condemned to death by making them swallow cultures of these bacilli. As soon as the malady should make its appearance, the remedies regarded as most efficacious could immediately be administered. I attach so much importance to these measures that if Your Majesty should share my views, I would gladly set out for Rio Janeiro, despite my age and state of health, in order to devote myself to this sort of study of the prophylaxis of hydrophobia, or the contagion of cholera, and the remedies to be applied to it. Letters cited by M. Valéry Radot in La Vie de Pasteur. His conscience became so troubled by this weight of responsibility that the famous scientist even thought of inoculating himself, when at last his experiments repeatedly tried upon animals gave such unmistakable results that he decided to apply his methods to human beings. The first inoculation was given to a boy 9 years old, an Alsatian named Joseph Meister, who had been seriously bitten by a mad dog on the 6th of July, 1885. He had 14 wounds and was in a lamentable state. The treatment began with the injection of the least virulent vaccine obtained from infected marrow 14 days old. The child stood it admirably, but Pasteur became anxious, distressed to the point of sleeplessness, when it became necessary to pass on to the virulent vaccines. How would the young patient respond to them? He stood them all without any apparent trouble, and 2 months from the time when he was first attacked, not a sign of hydrophobia had developed, nor did young Meister subsequently ever show any symptom of it. Then came another lad who had played the part of hero, a young shepherd by the name of J.B. Joupil, who successfully underwent the second treatment for hydrophobia. This boy, 15 years of age, had fought with a mad dog on the lands of Villers-Farlay in the Jura in order to save his comrades, 5 other young shepherds. He had been badly bitten in the struggle, and his case was more serious than that of Meister, because a whole week had passed between the day on which he had received his wounds and that on which he could be inoculated. Like the first patient, he received the hypodermic from Dr. Granchet with the assistance of Vulpian on Tuesday, October 29, 1885, and after a series of injections of vaccines, he was immune to hydrophobia. It was at the meeting of the Academy of Sciences, held October 26, 1885, that Pasteur made his communication on the subject of hydrophobia, preventive vaccination, and vaccination after bites as applied to man. Dr. Vulpian responded and paid homage to the genius of Pasteur. The Academy will not be surprised if, as a member of the section of medicine and surgery, I ask the floor in order to express the sentiments of admiration inspired in me by the communication of M. Pasteur. These will be shared, I am convinced, by the medical profession as a whole. Hydrophobia, that terrible disease against which all therapeutic efforts have hitherto failed, has at last found its remedy. M. Pasteur, who has had no precursor but himself along this route, has been led through a series of researches, uninterruptedly pursued for years, to create a method of treatment by the aid of which it is possible to prevent beyond all question the development of hydrophobia in a man recently bitten by a mad dog. I say beyond all question because after what I have seen in M. Pasteur's laboratory, I cannot myself doubt the permanent success of this treatment whenever it is applied in its full extent within a few days after the bite has been received. It becomes at once necessary to take steps toward the organization of a public system of treatment for hydrophobia according to the Pasteur method. Every individual bitten by a mad dog ought to be able to benefit by this great discovery, which puts the seal of glory upon our illustrious colleague and is destined to redound greatly to the honor of our country. It was Pasteur's destiny never to triumph through any of his discoveries until after he had overcome desperate resistance. The value of his method was questioned by a large part of the profession. He was ridiculed, and the comic papers published caricatures upon his work. Pasteur's enemies, who had not even yet disarmed in the presence of his genius, renewed their attacks in connection with a failure which occurred in December 1885, the death of a young girl, Louise who had been inoculated 37 days after she was bitten. Nevertheless, all resistance and all perfidy disappeared beneath the immense flood of enthusiasm which had been aroused by Pasteur's discoveries. A public system of vaccination against hydrophobia was installed, and people flocked there from all parts of France and from every other country. Within 1 year and 2 months, from October 1885 to December 1886, 2,682 persons who had been bitten were treated there, and out of this number only 31 succumbed. The efficacy of the method had been demonstrated. Pasteur took an interest in the children whom he treated, and lavished caresses and presents on them. He wrote to them after the course of treatment was over, trying to keep watch of their subsequent lives and urging upon them the advantages of honesty and industry. The great man, surrounded with the halo of glory and overburdened with his labors and his thoughts, found himself paternally drawn toward these little ones, and they were his best source of repose. End of Section 12.